to invite Robert Rumsby to come up here. Mr. Rumsby is an independent historian and researcher who has been involved in the U.S. Missing in Action accounting community for nearly 14 years and has worked with numerous non-governmental organizations. During this time, Mr. Rumsby has volunteered more than 17,000 hours, you heard that, 17,000, towards the mission, including over 2,400 hours of physical archival research, over 40 World War II veteran interviews, and over a dozen recovery and investigative site trips through Europe and the Pacific. Mr. Rumsby has provided research in the form of case summary reports to the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. I was going to go straight to DPAA there, which successfully led to the identification of 2 individuals who were formerly buried as unidentified service members from World War II, commonly referred to as unknowns. Many dozens more are currently in the analysis and identification process. Additionally, Mr. Rumsby continuously collaborates with the American Battle Monuments Commission, ABMC, on a volunteer basis by providing the commission with necessary research to accomplish their mission. Thank you for being here.
Appreciate the Alliance allowing me to do a presentation here for this annual meeting. A little bit about myself, how I got involved in this. I was about 13, going on 14 years old. It's about 13, going on 14 years old. Found out through an actual 8th grade history project that I had a great uncle that was killed in action in World War II. My grandfather had actually passed away a few years prior to that, so he never talked about it. So I started doing research. We found out that he was in the Army Air Corps and he was a tail gunner on a B-24. That's his crew, right? That's his crew. He's kneeling, second to left, and that's me right by his grave in France in Lorraine American Cemetery. So I started doing research, found out that he did a few cool things, a few heroic actions in the last moments of his life, and it led to the award of the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor. We eventually got awarded that a few years later after the fact, when I first documented it. Been on over a dozen now, investigative trips throughout the world, Europe, Pacific, mostly Europe, investigating aviation law sites throughout Western Europe, France, Germany, as you can see there. Been to Tarawa on a few recovery missions. This is 2015. A few days actually before we discovered Cemetery 27 that yielded the remains of 35 U.S. Marines and a Navy corpsman, to include Medal of Honor recipient Alexander Bonnyman. All right, so where does one begin? There's 73,000 individuals that are still unaccounted for World War II. So it's, 70 years later, how do you find an individual who's been missing for nearly a century? You got to start collecting the basic data, basic information of the individual, his unit, when he was missing. You can kind of associate from there. You can associate the unit and the date. You can figure out where that unit was assigned, where he was geographically in the world. Then from there, you can use a variety of different historical reports, textual reports. A lot of these are on microfilm now that can be turned into paper documents. You have your individual deceased personnel file. You have your missing aircraft reports, aircraft accident reports, which are very similar to missing aircraft reports. The only difference is, one, the missing aircraft reports are combat losses behind enemy locations. and the aircraft accident reports are within your own territory. So there's a little bit more evidence, hard facts in the aircraft accident reports and missing aircraft reports initially. Then you're talking about unit history reports and warning reports. These are focused records for ground losses. So unit reports, they're all at National Archives. Warning reports are in St. Louis. We have historians and private archivists that we work with to obtain those as well. And then X-Files. The X-Files are for the unidentified remains that are buried as unknown throughout our American cemeteries overseas, and a few here actually in our national cemeteries. There's roughly 8,500 individual remains or individuals associated with these unknowns buried in our overseas American cemeteries. From World War II, there's roughly another 800 from Korea that are still unidentified. And then aerial images. Aerial images are actually excellent sources. They're a little bit of pain to obtain. It's a very lengthy process. But if you find a good aerial site of, especially where you think the aircraft went down, you can start to correlate it, start to take the imagery of 1944, 1945, and overlay it to modern day imagery. Roads still exist, landmarks still exist, and you can overlay them, and you can correlate it to a very exact spot using lat, longitude, and military grid references. The military mapping system. All right, so what's in an individual deceased personnel file? This is the file that you want to go to in order to get the basic information of the individual loss. So these records contain dental files of the individual. Most of them do. Not all of them do, but I would part-bowl that at about 90%, 95% contain dental records of the individual. Contains witness affidavit statements from individuals who were with that loss. So it's going to you're creating a start point for your further research. This is where you can obtain them. This is where I obtain them. It's just a regular FOIA. The response ranges anywhere between that same day that I can get it back or 6 months later. It's kind of a hit and miss process right now, but in my holdings I have nearly almost 100,000 of these individual deceased files for World War II and Korea War losses. All right, so missing aircrew report. So if you don't know the missing aircrew report of an aviation loss, I usually just use this little database, and I'm pretty much in contact with the owner of this database, and he's allowed me to have access to it. So I can pull up any kind of information. So if I know the pilot's name, for instance, but I don't know the missing aircrew report, I can just type in the pilot's name, and it'll generate the missing aircrew report number, and then I can go to that in my files because I've downloaded all 60,500 missing aircrew reports over the years. And that's everyone that the Air Force has produced. The Department of the Air Force has produced. So what's in the missing aircrew report? It's just basic data. So it's gonna list the crew, which is on the bottom here. It's gonna list machine gun serial numbers. List machine gun serial numbers. It's gonna list the general area where the loss occurred, and then that's on the page on the left-hand side. That's what was generated by the unit of the loss within about a 48-hour period after the loss. And then on the right is the individual casualty questionnaire. These were filled out by survivors of the loss, if there were any, especially for bomber crews that had survivors, those who either became POWs or evaded and returned to American lines, Allied lines. So this one, there was a survivor on it, and this casualty questionnaire is filled out for an individual who is still unaccounted for. So it gives you basic information and where to draw from for your further research. So you can obtain them off all three, but I also have them all myself, and I distribute them to whoever needs it for their research. So if you have individuals who are trying to do research and they don't have them, or they don't know that they exist, I can produce them for you. Aircraft accident reports, they are very similar to missing aircrew reports that I previously mentioned. The only difference is these are for losses that occurred after or within American lines, within Allied control. So the loss site's very known, but there are losses. There are still unaccounted for service member who were lost in instances where bomber crews and fighter aircraft went down in instances like England. Say for this one is an 8th Air Force case. So right here, you have the airfield. You have the airfield where they took off from. So in this instance, B-24 took off, didn't make it off the ground, crashed 500 meters from the main takeoff strip. So we calculate 500 meters using current. This is what we use. We drew a main scale. Our GIS guys drew a main scale, a real life scale of what the airport looks like now, and it was actually extended. When you overlay this to the actual today's image, the airfield was extended, so the actual crash site is paved over currently. So likely of recovery, it's expensive to just tear up an airfield, and it's still an active airfield. It's used for local transportation within Southeast England. Same thing, the aircraft accident report, there's a database on it. If you don't know the pilot's name, or if you do, you know the pilot's name, but you don't know the number of the aircraft report number, you can pull it up, I can pull it up. All right, for unit history reports, these are more for ground losses that I focus on. So Record Group 407 in National Archives is where these are located. And they're sorted out by units. So they start out by higher echelon units, so your division level units, then they work their way down to regimental and battalion. Contained within these are typically after action reports, narratives from anywhere from your S2 shops to your S3, so your intelligence and operations shops created narrative reports on, say, a week-long battle or any sort of combat activity. So it reports where that location, it gives, in some cases it gives very detailed locations, so grid coordinates of where a specific platoon was operating in that battle. So if you can find an MIA in that platoon, you can start to narrow it down where this battle took from, or where it took place. And morning reports. Morning reports are another good source to search for ground losses. In some cases they're very helpful. In other cases, let's say in Normandy, let's say on D-Day invasion, we're looking at morning reports for guys that went missing on D-Day, on the morning of D-Day in June 6, 44. They don't pop up until August of 44, and they just declare them, missing. It's very chaotic, opening minutes to the Western push to defeat Germany. So there's not a lot of known facts about those individuals. So you have to go sift through these, and they're very tedious to look for, because sometimes a person might go missing, but it's not reported on a morning report for that unit until several weeks, even in several months that I've seen later. when it gets deeper into the war on especially on the western advance into Germany, they're very detailed, and an MIA will show up typically within two to 3 or 4 days after the fact that they go actually missing on the morning reports. All right, X-Files are the burial reports for the unknowns. These are the ones they're a treasure trove. So we recently got these about 5 to 6 years ago. They've been very helpful, extremely helpful with associating MIAs to unknowns, vice versa, unknowns to MIAs. We have created a project recently that started 2014, where we began data mining these X-Files and plotting their recovery locations. One of are the aerial images. All right, so aerial imagery is very helpful, especially when you don't know where an aviation site occurred, but you have a general area. You can spend days, weeks, just finding a source, finding these aerial images, and then weeks on end just tirelessly scanning through these. So here we knew B-24 crashed near this village. We spent, a couple days in there just trying to go through record group 373 that actually contained these, just trying to find this village contained within the overlays. So we eventually picked it up and we searched. We knew that it crashed somewhere near it. So we eventually found it about a few weeks later. There it is, circled in red. Here you can see where one of the wings broke off. And you can see the other wing with the tail stabilizer right here. It's B-24 site. So it's amazing what you can find, and now what you can do is just translate that to overall imagery, current imagery. That road still exists in France. So it's pretty crazy that we found that way. We've created an actual database of all the missing by units and by dates. And this took a tireless effort of collaboration with the American Battle Alliance Commission and going through the rosters of the dead for World War II. It's like a 15-year project that I didn't start it. It was started by other individuals, and we finished it recently. This is the project that we created for the unknowns. We data mined all the unknown files. We recorded if it was available, that X file was available. We recorded the recovery location, details of the remains. If there were dentals, we charted their dental charts. We took any kind of material evidence that we found with them. We put them in additional burial details, and we have their coordinates. The best recovery coordinates that we can find within the X-Files. And right here, you can see just a little sample of what we've been able to do. All of these little points are recovery points for the unknowns that we've been able to plot. Blue ones are ground loss sites that we've been able to definitively point to ground loss and tree loss sites. And the ones in circle yellow circle are aviation losses. And we know they are aviation losses because the material evidence found with the remains leads to the definitive aviation loss. It shows flying clothing, any type of found in a crash, aviation crash site. So we know that they are aviation losses. All right, so one case example. This is Lieutenant Fred Brewer. He's a Tuskegee Airman, and he was a fighter pilot of the 332nd Fighter Group that flew out of Italy, the 15th Air Force. That day, their unit was the 332nd. Two of the squadrons were on a mission to escort bombers. They actually never linked up with the bombers. The bombers were returned home due to 1010 cloud coverage, which is basically you can't see anything. It would have been a tactical, pointless mission. All right, so the date was 29 October 1944. He was known to be lost about 3.5 miles northwest of Dullach, Germany, which is now Austria. It's part of Austria today. And an aircraft, this is important to note, to highlight, this is one of the aircraft serial numbers found at the crash site, as I'll note later. So this was, the prior slide was from his missing aircrew report. So this is an X-file of an unknown that is buried in Florence American Cemetery in northern Italy. Here's a witness statement contained within that X-file that associates the remains with a American fighter plane that was recovered. Can't pronounce the Italian town, very bad with it. It's Maggio Udinese. And the witness states that the plane crashed on Sunday, 29 October 1944 at 11 a.m. And the previous slide shows that Lieutenant Brewer went missing on that date at that time. And so this one, so this is the recovery site of that aviation loss in northern Italy. And here's where Lieutenant Brewer, the approximate location where Lieutenant Brewer went missing. And the straight line distance is 18 miles. Okay. I didn't include the slide here, or include the witness statement on the slide, but the serial number of the aircraft was, or the serial number of one of the machine guns was found at the site, and it correlated directly back to Lieutenant Brewer's P-51 aircraft. These are a little, you can see here, this is, just to reiterate, this is Lieutenant, this is the crash site of the unknown associated with Lieutenant Brewer, and this is where Lieutenant Brewer went missing. Okay. So just to recap, the lines of evidence for that case are extremely strong. He's still, from what I've known, he's still buried as an unknown at Florence American Cemetery. That's going to be one of my next cases. I'm going to be pushing to have the family, if there is interest from the family, to get involved and try to do a disinterment of those remains for identification. Just to rehash, the location is highly favorable. It's within 18 miles from the recovery location to the lost location, where he was said to be lost by his fellow aviators in that formation. The date and the time match from the eyewitness on the ground that saw the aviation loss. Machine gun serial number, which is material evidence, led to a direct correlation to Lieutenant Brewer's, one of his machine guns on his P-51 Mustang. So you have 3 hardline pieces of evidence that link that individual to those sets of remains. What can you do about it? Well, if you're a family member, I kind of created this presentation for families. So what you can do about it, just maintain contact with myself. I might not be the expert for areas such as, let's say, the Philippines, but I know somebody who has a substantial amount of Philippine or lost site, knows a lot about the battles in the Philippines, knows a lot about where remains were sent in the process for the Pacific. I focus mostly on aviation and ground loss sites in Europe. What you can do also is family members, if you know family members, is submit the DNA reference sample to, if you're an eligible reference sample, submit your DNA to the service casualty offices. And we have those addresses on the next line. And then you submit your request for IDPS. You can just ask me for them. I probably have, hopefully have yours associated with your loved ones. These are the service casualty offices. Numbers may have changed. This is a very old slide, but I can point you. I know this goes at least ahead, so I can point you in their direction and get you their contact information. They can point you in the right direction, get your case started. It's a struggle. I can tell you that right now. Communication's not the greatest at times. It's a lot of patience. It's a lot of hard work. I don't really know how to articulate it, but you have to have that intestinal fortitude to just keep carrying on, even when you just want to just give up and not pursue it anymore because you're not receiving any feedback and you feel like you're talking to a wall. And, it's a difficult process. It's a difficult thing. But I can tell you, I've had very good success working these cases, especially if you the family are extremely involved. I can tell you that I started one case in December and the remains were already disinterred and they're currently in the lab awaiting identification. So within a 5-6 month period, we've been able to bring the case from there's nothing to, this family might have a burial within 6 months, hopefully, fingers crossed, that is the individual in question. So it's, like I said, it's as you all know, it's just a process that we shouldn't have to do, but that's an ideal world, and we don't live in that ideal world. So ordinary citizens have to step up and act upon it. And then this is pretty much when people ask me like, why are you doing this? These guys have been gone for 70 years, 80 years, approaching 80 years now. It's just it's these families. A lot of these families are going to be gone, especially Korean War, World War II. These families are going to be gone within the next 10 years, 20 years. They're not going to. Anybody who knew these individuals aren't going to be around. So it's not only for the families, but they might disappear, within the next generation. But it's for the dignity of that individual who, there was an induction and there was a draft in World War II, but it was pretty much the entire nation stepping up, and that's how you honor the individual. That's how you honor the country and what it stood for. Their dignity and their that proper burial and that proper honor ceremony. And that's what we aim for every time you step in and try to get one of these cases it's to honor that individual.
How do we get you working on other awards? That's the only quick. We clone you?
I've helped John with the.
Oh, you've helped him a lot, but we still need more of you. More.
Yeah.
You're doing a great job.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, if you don't have a family member who's represented,
I don't know. I don't see him here
are
yet.
you able to proceed, or do you tell us
people inside
in order to get the commission to turn?
Like they can go in and do something.
Oh, he's over there. You want to come over?
Sure, tell us.
So he asked a very good question. This has come up a lot in my research. So he asked, does there have to be a relative, in the process or interested in doing it? In most cases, no. I'll say this right now, for Lieutenant Brewer, we have when I started Lieutenant Brewer's case, we did not have a relative. I hate saying this before the relative knows, it's because I hate them finding out this way that, you know, their relative can be buried in such and such a grave in Florida or anywhere. But there doesn't have to be. We have genealogists that do track down relatives for these missing individuals. So let's say in the case of Herman Mulligan, I've been able to openly discuss this case because the family does not mind me sharing the information, or me sharing that information.
Depends on the subject.
So in the case of Herman Mulligan, we narrowed it down to a set number of individuals. In order to disinter and proceed with the disinterment, there has to be a 50% or greater chance of identification of those remains. So let's say if we narrow it down historically to, let's say, 20 individuals, and then that report goes to the forensics team, the odontologist, which consists of the odontologist or the anthropologist, and they further narrow it down to 4 individuals, then there has to be DNA on file for at least 2 of those individuals. So that they can then proceed for disinterments, because there has to be a greater than 50% chance of identification. So they don't, right now they don't want to what I'm saying is DOD and DPAA does not want to disinter a bunch of remains and then not to be identified and sit in the lab. And they have, I think there's a mandate, they have to be identified within a 24-month period, or they have to be put back into a place of honor, which is where they originated from in the American military cemeteries overseas. It's a historical and circumstantial lead identification system. I highly disagree with it. As a private individual, I highly disagree with the way that it functions right now. Currently, there's, between World War II and Korea, there's roughly 9,000 unknowns that are still buried in our cemeteries in Hawaii, overseas in Europe and the Philippines. They can be systematically disinterred, and power of genealogists to go track these family reference samples, especially for World War II, where there's only roughly 5 to 6% of eligible reference samples for these individuals that are missing on file. Korea is a little bit different. It's about 90% of the reference samples are on file. But if you had a DNA, especially a paternal line DNA system, so you're talking nuclear DNA system, a nuclear DNA lead identification system, you'll be able to identify these individuals, these unknowns, much more rapidly than you're able to just identify them using the current process. There's talk about how long that would take, and the individuals who have done this before in other mass disaster cases, mass casualty loss cases like the World Trade Center, Bosnia, those are 2 examples. It would take anywhere between 3 to 5 years to identify these 9,000 individuals that are missing, that are still buried as unknowns. It would take a collaborative effort. I'm not saying that the anthropology and the historical information of the known about these individuals is not relevant, but what needs to happen in order to rapidly produce these identifications is to systematically disinter these remains, do a DNA-led identification process, and then have the historical information and the anthropological and odontological, which is dental remains, to support those identifications. Currently, that's not the case. It's the opposite way, and that's why it's taken so long to identify. The other instance is the Armed Forces Identification Laboratory doesn't have capacity to sequence the number of bone samples required to make these identifications. Right now, they're about at the capacity to do 4,500 bone samples per year. Let's say if we're talking Cabanatuan, which is a POW camp, there's roughly 1,000 individuals that are buried as unknowns from that POW camp alone. And they're known to be, at this point, highly commingled. So you're talking 12 long bones in a human body, plus their jaw and their main portion of the skull. That's 14 bone samples at once for one individual. Multiply that by 1,000. That's 14,000 bone samples. That's 3 or 4 years of active capacity just in one project. And then you're talking about the lab space to store and hold those remains. The capability isn't the capability or first the process isn't there, and then the logistics and the resources, the capability isn't there. Even if the process was there, the capability is there not to support it. AFSIL has increased its capacity by 4 times the amount in the last few years, but it's still not enough to make 2,000 identifications a year for the next 4 or 5 years for the unknowns. It could probably do about 150 a year at this current rate.
Can you expound, when we were talking, you said that you have a larger database than the government, and you had offered to give or let the government use your database and they didn't want to use it?
Yes. Currently, right now, we're trying to work out a strategic partnership with DPAA with our database, but they're saying we already have a database, we don't really need it. But I don't want to talk too much on that right now. It's because we're trying to build that agreement and work it out and not have shoot myself in the foot right now.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Have you considered taking your database to the Veterans Affairs Committee and tell them what